If you're watching this right now, there is a good chance you found my channel through my coverage of series like Resident Evil or Silent Hill, which is fitting. I mean, those are two of my favorite game franchises of all time. But I've sort of developed this reputation here on YouTube as the survival horror fanatic, and while that's not exactly false, it might paint an inaccurate picture of the games I actually spend most of my time with. Don't get me wrong, survival horror games are a passion for me, but there are very few actual titles to be found in that genre, sadly. And on top of that, I'd say 75% of my relatively okay-sized game collection actually consists of role-playing games. As a kid, I grew up on old SNES JRPGs thanks to a cousin introducing me to Final Fantasy IV, and if you popped in on me during my early teenage years, you'd have a 50-50 shot at either seeing something like this or something like this. So I figured it was time to put some real effort towards bringing you guys into the rest of my little gaming habit. But I'm left with a bit of a conundrum. Do I spend a bunch of time and effort rephrasing what countless people here on YouTube have said about some of the most famous role-playing franchises of all time? Because it seems like all the good games in the genre have already been done to death at this point. So with that issue in mind, I took a hard look at my collection and picked out the RPGs you don't really hear about too often. The ones that rode that role-playing wave and never really left a long-lasting impression on people you'd see with stuff like Final Fantasy or Persona. The misfits of this odd little genre. So today, I hope you'll join me on a bit of a detour from my normal stuff while I cover some of the most fun and impactful role-playing titles that, for whatever reason, never really caught on with the mainstream. Games that may have been misunderstood or were never given a chance to shine in the first place. So if you're down for a little change of pace, I'd like to do just that. Oh, and before we start, just as a heads up, I captured a lot of this footage back when the OSSC was the talk of the town as far as line multipliers went, which means sadly there's going to be less 1440p Tink 5X footage than I'd like because I'm not about to re-record nearly 900 gigs of gameplay capture. Hopefully a measly 960p will do for now, but with all that info literally none of you care about out of the way, what's up guys, I'm Jared and this is Avalanche Reviews. In the spirit of easing you guys into this concept, I figured we would start with the lighter stuff. I'm sure all of you are familiar with the Shining Force series, and if you're not, damn do I recommend you get that way. These strategy RPGs are some of the most satisfying and mechanically pleasing games on the Genesis, and throughout the rest of the Shining series there are a few hidden gems to be found as well. Ones that span nearly every RPG subgenre you can think of, including a few you can't, like fighting games, because why the hell not? I actually first came across Shining Soul when I got real heavy into the world of Game Boy Advance emulation. Yeah, for a long while I was more interested in having a complete digital library of games, which really sits in stark contrast to my current, if it ain't real hardware, I ain't playing it frame of mind. But all that aside, I was hooked on Shining Soul's relatively simple gameplay right from the start. And by the way, you're looking at the second Shining Soul game, which is the one I recommend the most, but either one's gonna do you just fine. And when I said simple before, I really did mean simple. The best way I can describe it is a chibi-looking, shrunk-down version of Diablo. At the start, you choose your character class, which will determine what weapon/equipment you're gonna make use of and whether or not you'll be taking advantage of any magic spells. From there, you get a pretty bog-standard story involving saving a kingdom from a coming darkness, and honestly, I wouldn't blame you for skipping over it. Hell, I love this game, and that's what I'm about to do right now. It's certainly not bad or anything, but it's clear the devs focused more on the gameplay loop than the story, and that's perfectly fine. What's here, though, is enough to get you from point A to point B, and really it doesn't need to be anything more than that. So when arriving at said point, what can you expect? Well, combat. A lot of combat. Shining Soul's an action RPG, which means we'll be fighting in real time here. The A button is your attack, B uses items you have in your quick slots, and the shoulder button switches between those items and your equipped weapons. As your character levels up, you can assign points to their individual stats and to a series of perks like weapon expertise, critical rate, or learning spells. You have a hub area you can return to from any dungeon with a certain item, and here you can talk to people, progress the story, identify items you found in dungeons, and more importantly, buy and sell loot. Like I said before, Shining Soul resembles a Diablo clone, with its emphasis being centered around clearing dungeons, finding gear, and grinding for level ups. And for some of you, that may sound like a pretty middle-of-the-road experience, and truth be told, before I played this game, that's exactly what I thought, but there's something so relaxing about entering a dungeon, gaining a couple of levels, and finding that weapon that'll make grinding even more satisfying. And the fact that you control where your points go after a level up makes it even more fun. This may not be one of those deep story-driven type of experiences that are commonly associated with the genre, but I really can't stress enough how fun it is to just turn the game on, gain a few levels and some fresh loot, and then turn it back off again. Thanks to the portable nature of the platform, Shining Soul plays perfectly into that easy to pick up, easy to put down mentality. Every time you turn this game on, you won't be too far from some kind of a gameplay milestone like a level up or a new piece of equipment, so you won't have to invest long hours in it till you feel satisfied. Although I am living proof investing those long hours can be equally as satisfying. It's rare for an RPG to support both long-time investments and a short pick-up-and-play approach simultaneously, but that is exactly what you're going to find here. And on that note, I enjoy the amount of variety to be found in this game. Just to get some footage for this video, I started up as a ninja, which is a pretty common practice for me, but about halfway through I decided I wanted to see what the Dragoon class was like, and I love how much this changed the game for me. A lot of times when I play, I select the archer, and I haven't even tried any magic users yet. From what I understand, there's a multiplayer component to the game as well, but me playing this on the Game Boy player pretty much locks me out of that, which is good because otherwise I'd have to admit I don't really have any friends. To be honest though, I would love to see a multiplayer Shining Soul session for myself. I feel like there's all kinds of the game's mechanics that would synergize nicely with having another person present in a dungeon. Not to worry though, even if the multiplayer is the most satisfying gameplay experience imaginable, I can confirm the single player is fun as hell regardless. And believe me, I know this sounds boring on paper. I mean, to get to level 20, I basically played the same 4 dungeons over and over again for hours, but I just can't explain how hard your dopamine's going to spike after finally coming across a weapon or piece of armor that makes the area you've been grinding in a breeze. And there's something that just feels right about the process of completing a dungeon, heading back into town to sell all the cool stuff you found, loading up on healing items, and jumping right back into that same dungeon to do it all again. It just makes for the most calm and satisfying experience. In fact, I sort of screwed myself by starting this game back up, because now I'm locked into leveling a new character, and when I have free time, I usually find myself reaching for that GameCube power button to snag a couple of quick levels, which may or may not have eaten into the time it took to finally get this video finished. Visually speaking, there's not really a lot going on here. The simplistic nature of the super deformed graphics are cute as hell, but there are some enemies that'll have you wondering just what in the hell they're supposed to be. Each of the game's classes has a good number of color palettes to swap through, so you'll probably end up with a character you'll enjoy looking at for long hours at a time. The character portraits fit perfectly into that Shining game stereotype, that is to say adorably nice looking, and I love how the inventory system is laid out like a chessboard or something. Now I will admit, with all the navigating you'll be doing from this menu, a simple list view would have been much more efficient, but this won't get in your way too much, or at least it didn't for me. Like I said before, I'm capturing this footage through a GameCube's Game Boy player using GBI to get an accurate and sharp video output to feed into my Tank 5X, and if you ask me, this is just the best way to view these chunky pixels. Don't get me wrong, that AGS 101 screen is nice and all, but you really can't compete with an integer correct 6x scale on a modern TV. But regardless of what display you use to view them, Shining Soul and Shining Soul II are incredibly addicting and well worth taking a look at. Just make sure to clear your schedule beforehand, you know, just in case. Alright, I know this might be an odd inclusion. After all, Suikoden is a fairly popular series, but Is it though? As a teen who was heavily into these type of games, I never really saw widespread discussion of these incredible PS1 JRPGs. It seems like it was only recently that people genuinely gave the series the sort of attention it deserves, and even now I'd argue it needs way more, even though I admit it may not be exactly evident why given just a cursory glance. Suikodens I and II, aka the games everyone knows the series for, took a very traditional approach towards JRPGs, and that especially applies to the graphics. I mean, obviously it wasn't too uncommon to see 2D sprite-based games on Sony's PlayStation at the time, but most companies were going 3D, and if you ask me, Konami made the right move there. Realistically, the amount of money it would have cost for them to have made a mediocre-looking 3D game could have gotten them an amazing-looking 2D sprite-based game, and the good news is that's exactly what these are. Suikodens I and II look absolutely incredible, especially too with its expressive animations. But as much as I love talking classic PS1 2D graphics, there's a lot more going on here. Each PS1 entry has a story that I can really only describe as heartwarming. You can tell the developers really wanted to have people wowed by their interesting and lovable characters and not so much their dark and brooding story, but that's not to say there isn't real emotional turmoil to be found here. For having such a lighthearted approach to character interaction, these guys sure went all out with depicting drama and loss. In fact, as I'm saying this, the Suikoden fans watching will definitely start drifting off, thinking about that one scene that brought them to tears. Of course, not me though. I'm a big manly man, and there's no way a cute, driven, determined character like Nanami could ever make me cry. Definitely not. Anyways, Suikoden has a very unique and incredibly earnest appeal to its narratives, each one having to do with the concept of conflict, specifically war, how its effects can be felt down to the lowest levels of society, and how despite being so destructive, it can still bring people together in a lot of ways. On top of the sappy emotional stuff though, combat in Suikoden games can be some of the most fun and attractive offerings you'll find in the traditional turn-based JRPG sector. At the time, I was used to seeing maybe 3 or 4 of my characters on screen at once, but Suikoden was the first time I can remember having this many party members take part in a fight. Of course, just having more characters on screen isn't all that interesting, but issuing commands and having your party executing all of them simultaneously just adds this feeling of chaos and randomness to a fight. It feels really awesome spending some time setting up a great offense and seeing all of your party members jump into the fray at once. I'm gonna level with you guys, this is still the only series that gives me that feeling in combat, and even though I can't really describe it very well, here's hoping some footage makes my point for me. If you've even heard of these games secondhand, you've likely been told about their one big feature, and that is an absolutely massive cast of playable characters. And while each one isn't exactly going to have a thorough and well-expressed character arc, I did end up getting attached to quite a few of the smaller roles. And if that's not drawing you in, I can personally confirm that collecting these party members will satisfy that part of you that likes checking every nook and cranny for content in a role-playing game. Hands down, Suikodens I and II should be in every RPG fan's collection, be that physical or digital. You guys know typically I recommend the former and not the latter, but hey, most of us don't have hundreds of dollars we can throw around frivolously, and pretty much if you didn't keep your original copies like me and a select few others, you're going to be paying out the ass for it. However, I can say that maybe in this one instance, it might be worth the price of entry. Now, moving on to the later games in the series, you may not encounter quite so much fan love, but there are a few diamonds in the rough here. Mechanically speaking, Suikoden IV made me feel the most like I was playing an actual Suikoden game, but I will warn you, this bad boy takes a good long while to really hit its stride. I'd say the game finally opens up and starts letting you play it around hour 2, which I know isn't what you want to hear before diving into a role-playing game, but sometimes that slow burn is worth enduring, and this is definitely one of those cases. The story is definitely not going to hit the highs of the first 2 games, but it's honestly really good once it gets out of its own way. The combat can be really fun, but do prepare yourself for a very high encounter rate. I know stuff like this can be totally subjective, but I'm a big fan of grinding in RPGs, and even to me, this feels excessive.
That's right. He and his entire family were executed, weren't they?
Suikoden V is probably the most solidly designed in an all-around RPG sort of sense, but it also has the least amount of personality among the series in my opinion. Now don't get me wrong, it's not a bad game, it just doesn't feel anywhere near as unique as the other Suikoden titles.
Come on, Hervey, you and I!
And speaking of unique, we were lucky enough to see a strategy RPG entry in the form of Suikoden Tactics, a game that despite doing a lot of things I don't like, is still one hell of a fun time. The story can be a bit childish in the way there's always a clear line separating good from evil, but it has some of the most satisfying strategy RPG combat you're likely to find. Being a title in a series known for going against the typical grain, Tactics features a twist on what you might be used to from the genre in the form of a very interesting element system, which has certain attacks or actions coloring the playfield in a specific elemental alignment. From then on, characters who are weak to that element will take damage and debuffs while standing on that section of the map or receive a buff and healing if they're aligned to it. This one really small change makes for some killer fights and adds just one more degree of complexity to a combat system that's already pretty complex. That being the case, like other strategy RPGs, you will be spending a lot of time in combat here. It's not exactly out of the ordinary for you to spend more than an hour in a single fight in this game. Of course, you're going to enjoy that time spent making moves and deciding actions, but that might be too substantial of a commitment for people outside of the strategy RPG world, or as I like to call them, people with jobs and responsibilities. Of course, I couldn't finish this segment without talking about the news of what is essentially a new Suikoden game. The creator of the series, tired of Konami's iron grip over it, decided to make a go of bringing all the same Suikoden charm and grace to a new game that will act as the blood-stained ritual of the night to Suikoden's Castlevania, if you get my drift. We may not have a lot to go off of, but we do have some character art to drool over and a mock-up of how they want the battle mechanics to work. And can I just say, if they hit even 50% of this amazing looking goal, we'll have one of the flashiest and most interesting combat systems I've ever seen before. Eiyuden Chronicle hit Kickstarter a while back, and like you might assume, I backed it within seconds of hearing about its existence. It's been up a while, and I haven't really heard anything substantial since, but the developer Rabbit and Bear Studios has put up a website. Of course, try to keep in mind I've been working on this RPG project forever, so there's a very good chance that you're watching this much later than when I wrote and recorded this segment. So make sure to keep your eyes open for any new information. If this project makes it into the slim portion of Kickstarter games that actually get developed, this may be the coming of a new role-playing powerhouse development company, and I think we can all agree that's exactly what this small genre needs right now. Alright, so pivoting back to a Nintendo console, let's talk about an RPG most people haven't played because they technically haven't been able to. Emerald Dragon on the SNES is an odd little JRPG that takes a lot of steps away from the standard model most of these games are built from. Which I guess makes sense because this is the first game on the list that got its start as a PC title. Before hitting the Super Famicom, this game was released on a Japan-only line of home computers, including the famous Sharp X68000, and there's a lot of that DNA still present in the Super Famicom release, with an emphasis on Windows filling the screen and its very untraditional fighting system. That being said, I wouldn't exactly call this a port. So much has been changed as far as the game's look and feel that this is more like a remake or maybe even a demake to me. But anyways, this is the tale of a race of dragons living in their own self-contained world when somehow a ship wrecks on their shore, stranding a single human girl named Tamrin there with them. After a few years, she's grown to see the dragons as her own family, but the tribe decides she needs to return to her world, but before she does, Atrashan here gives her a piece of his horn, which will let her call him if she ever needs to. And no points for guessing she eventually does do that, leading Atrashan to come after her, but since dragons can't spend much time in the human world without dying from some kind of a curse, he takes a human form that for some reason trips that system up, which proceeds to get him involved in a war between regular people and a group quite literally named the Evil Army. Okay, so the story is relatively alright, but what I enjoyed more was the handful of side stories you get with other characters. I will admit I haven't beaten this one yet, so I may not know exactly how it ends, but I'll say as of the halfway point, the story is pretty enjoyable. I mean, it doesn't do a lot that I haven't seen before, but it does a good enough job at introducing me to a few memorable characters and serves as a reason for me to continue enjoying the very strange combat. In Emerald Dragon, getting into a fight will send you to this screen where you get to experience a sort of strategy and traditional turn-based RPG hybrid. You're only ever allowed to take control of your main character Atrashan, but the AI here is good enough that I don't really mind this, even though in most games I typically do. Besides, without me taking time to decide what to do next with each party member, the battles go by way faster, giving them this very speedy pace. How far you can move will be highlighted, and attacking is handled by essentially bumping into enemies, sort of like how combat is in the early Ys games. Depending on how many action points you used while moving, you can also attack several times per turn, which is always really cool to see. You also get the ability to switch over to Atrashan's dragon form for a short time, and this feels about as cool as it does in the Breath of Fire games. I can definitely say this unique combat is the major draw here, but all the other stuff meets your typical RPG needs as well. There's a great little soundtrack that, while never hitting Chrono Cross or Donkey Kong Country levels of memorability, still does a great job of capturing the feel of your surroundings and what's going on in them. The sprite art is also really great looking, which I thought might be thanks to its PC origins, but it looks like the Super Famicom release has a way different look than the other versions. Hell, I'd even say it's an upgrade. And we would have absolutely missed out on this cool little RPG if it weren't for Nightcrawler's Translation Corps, who put out the only existing English translation I'm aware of. So massive thanks to them and really anyone who dedicates their time to these type of projects. These guys are essentially responsible for introducing a huge amount of great games to me and the entire English-speaking world as well. Man, talk about a killer way to positively affect a massive amount of people. But heartfelt thanks aside, I would definitely recommend you guys check out Emerald Dragon. It's got a style all of its own, and in a genre that can often repeat itself, it's awesome to see a title like this come in and really shake up the established norms.
This'll teach you, you punk!
There's no doubt that most of you have heard about the Grandia series, and I bet you're probably wondering what the hell such a well-known franchise is doing in this video, but don't you worry, we're getting to that. A lot of game collectors and retro game fanatics seem to go crazy for the first entry, and I can sort of see why. I mean, it has an amazingly charming style, and it started Grandia's very unique approach to RPG combat, which we should probably talk about. In these games, each party member and enemy participating in a fight will be on a sort of circular scale that shows exactly how close they are to filling their active time bar. Once it's filled up, an action can be performed, but you still have to wait a little bit longer. This area here between command and action will fill slower or quicker depending on what you're doing. If you're executing a simple attack, it's near instantaneous, but if you choose a powerful special, you'd be open for attack till the rest of your meter fills up. During this time, an enemy could hit you with a critical and essentially cancel your turn, the good news being you can do the same for them. Now, I will admit this is an amazingly engaging combat system, but if you ask me, past the killer anime artwork and incredibly innovative combat, Grandia is a little lackluster nowadays. It can be very clunky. The game slows to a crawl anytime more than a few sprites are on screen, and the camera's so zoomed in that developers had to add areas to dungeons that would let you zoom out just so you could see what's actually around you. Now, I'm not saying this is a bad game by any means, but when you compare it to the games that came after, it definitely fits into the lowest spot in the series. Speaking of which, about 3 years later, we got Grandia II on the Dreamcast, and in my opinion, this is where Grandia really found itself.
Ryudo, I cannot take much more of this.
Quit your belly aching and fly, damn it!
The amazingly innovative combat system was brought over with just a few tweaks to make it feel a little more satisfying, and it had a camera I didn't hate. Although it does this weird thing where the camera zooms out when you start moving and back in when you stop, which really gets on my nerves. The anime aesthetic has returned also, and I absolutely love it. There's some pretty okay voice acting to be found, which was definitely a product of its time, but what I loved most was the addition of travel time to the battle meter. Sure, you may have already filled your meter and input a command, but you had to get your character to the target. This added a much needed amount of depth to choosing your actions, and you started to get used to how fast or slow each character was on their feet. Using a critical hit to stop an enemy that's charging up some kind of a massive spell still feels great, and the overall impact of attacks and misses is just perfect. The Dreamcast was amazing at delivering big, colorful 3D graphics, and Grandia II is a great example of that. I've never been a fan of 2D world maps that act like a menu with selectable areas to visit, but if that's my only problem here, then we're off to a really good start. I do want to add that we're looking at the PS2 port of the game, and it would otherwise be perfect if it wasn't for a whole lot of slowdown that wasn't present in the original. It doesn't seem to happen in fights, which is a good thing, but if you get annoyed by stuff like that, then maybe go with the Dreamcast original.
That self-righteous pig. If I ever see him again, I'll shove my fist down his...
After that, we got the PS2 exclusive Grandia Extreme, a game that's pretty good in its own right, but the dungeon crawler nature of it just doesn't fit very well with the globetrotting feel of the other games in the series. I do really enjoy this one, but it's time to get to the actual point of this little section. In 2005, we got the 4th entry in the Grandia series on the PS2, and for some reason this game always seems to get shit on, and well, that's why it's on the list. Me and my wife picked up Grandia III while staying at a buddy's house, and it was love at first sight. That early 2000s anime look that made most people write it off just looked amazing to me, and the additions to the combat system made it the most fun entry in the series by a country mile. The rotary active time meter returns, and everything works pretty much exactly like it did in the previous games, but with massive amounts of polish. The fights seem snappier and more fun to play through, and the jaw-dropping visuals make each encounter something I actually look forward to. Along with the expected Grandia battle mechanics, 3 adds this really cool feature where if you're able to time your attacks just right so they perfectly follow a critical attack, you can do this killer little air combo, and you get rewarded for how high you're able to go. There's something about nailing these follow-up attacks that makes the combat so damn satisfying I just can't describe it. This one little addition really makes the fights in the game an absolute joy and might be some of the most engaging RPG combat I've ever played before. Graphically speaking, this is easily one of the best looking games on the platform. I mean, sure, it doesn't get anywhere near games like Silent Hill 3 or Metal Gear Solid 2 as far as depicting real human proportions, but the stylized look is perfectly pulled off here. It has this amazing sense of color and some of the absolute best menus, 2D art, and heads-up displays I've ever seen in a role-playing game. Every little corner of this game is just dripping with style, and there were plenty of times where I would just stop playing and take in how gorgeous everything around me is. Seriously guys, this is an absolute dream visually speaking. But if I had one tiny, minuscule complaint, it would be directed towards the interlaced video output with no option for progressive scan. I often use an app called GSM to force 480p in PS2 games that don't natively support it, but I just could not get it working with Grandia III, which is a real shame because I imagine this would knock me out of my chair at a true progressive scan resolution. The good news is you could use something like the OSSC, FrameMeister, or Tink 5X to de-interlace this game and it looks absolutely amazing. And back to the actual game, the soundtrack is equally as charming as the visuals. The individual tracks may not be as memorable or hummable as Grandia II, but they sound great regardless. Oh yeah, and I'm gonna say something that's gonna get me a lot of shit, but the voice acting is also great.
What is that, Yuki?
This? It's a kind of alarm. If somebody tries to sneak up on us, we'll know.
I know I'm insane, but I genuinely enjoy early 2000s anime tier voice acting. All the games in the series so far were made primarily by Game Arts, but this time around they had the funding of Squaresoft behind them, and it really shows. Like I said before, polish is the name of the game here. By this point, Grandia was already well known for its unique style, but these guys had the funds to really make something special with 3, and I think they succeeded at that goal with flying colors. In my opinion, Grandia III is the best entry in this prolific series by a long shot. It takes everything that fans loved about the previous entries and added just a few tweaks to make it all feel so much better. If you happen to be in the market for one of those RPGs where you go out of your way to get into every encounter you can, well, might I suggest you add Grandia III to your backlog. Trust me, you will not regret it. With all the love Sony's been getting so far on this list, I think it's only fair we switch over to the Sega Saturn for a bit. A console I actually missed out on when it was at its prime, but a friend brought me into the world of awesome Saturn RPGs, and later when I would first visit Tokyo with my wife, one of the first games I would ever purchase for the console would be the Japan-only strategy RPG, Wachenroder. One of those rare titles where you can sort of understand why it never came stateside. Not only was it released on a console that historically did not do well over here, but it was a part of a small subgenre that isn't exactly well known for making a lot of money. That being said, this is very much a game worth checking out. The only problem being, well, I'm not going to sugarcoat this, Wachenroder was never translated in the traditional sense, so there's no way to sit down and play this in English. Unless you do what I did and open a translation guide that can be found on GameFAQs on a phone or a tablet and play through it while glancing down to follow along. Now, I know that sounds crappy, but honestly with a strategy RPG, it really doesn't take away from anything. All of the text boxes can be advanced by you, so there's no worry of accidentally missing out on anything on screen. And if you've ever played any other turn-based strategy RPGs, you'll probably be able to navigate your way through the combat without any issues at all. But the question is, why am I recommending you guys go this far out of your way just to play some unheard of title that never left Japan? Well, Wachenroder has this incredibly recognizable style, and it brings some awesome tweaks to the typical mechanics seen in the genre. And first off is the 3D animations that play for special attacks. These things are just dripping with that early 90s, we're just now figuring out 3D graphics on a console that wasn't really built for them kind of style, and they really are a treat for people like me who get into that early PS1 approach to these kinds of graphics. On top of that, the game adds this mechanic where you can rev up party members' weapons to increase their damage output. This system has a cool little risk-reward thing going on, as you can deal a significant amount of extra damage doing this, but it doesn't take much to fill up your temperature gauge, and when you overheat, it'll take a few turns till you can act again. This is also one of those strategy RPGs that lets you choose between moving long distances and making several actions, which I always love. The battles definitely play out in a way that's familiar to other games in the genre like Final Fantasy Tactics, but it keeps a feel all its own as well. A fact that's driven home by many of the people working on it coming from the anime industry, including Takayuki Takeya, who's famous for his work on the Iria anime adaptation. Or was the live-action movie the adaptation? Oh well, who cares? The important thing is the art in this game is incredibly unique. What really caught my eye from the start, though, was the live-action intro and cutscenes that use miniatures to achieve one of the coolest aesthetics ever. Oh, and the animated sprite work here on the title screen is absolutely to die for. The story here is a dark one that deals with a world wrought with environmental damage and a really cool revenge plot. Also, for some reason, I just always appreciate seeing steampunk elements in JRPGs. All around, this is a worthy title for your collection if you're into games like Tactics Ogre or FFT, and let's face it, as strategy RPG lovers, we don't exactly have a deep well of titles to draw from. So if you're down with playing a video game in a relatively unconventional way, I think this is one RPG really worth putting the effort in. Besides, maybe if enough of us start talking about it, some fan translator out there might finally give it the attention it deserves.
So this is her.
After the success of Final Fantasy VII, the whole industry opened its eyes to the possibility of a JRPG becoming a console seller, and who better to make a console seller than the company that owns the damn console it's selling? Legend of Dragoon was developed by the aptly named Japan Studio, which was essentially the game development arm of Sony Entertainment. Its creation was part of a trend that would see other developers going after the, well, I just finished FF7, I wonder if there's any other games on the PS1 that plays like that market. And sure, you could argue something spawned from that level of mimicry could be a little derivative, but that's certainly not the case here. Much like Silent Hill, coming from the goal of emulating Resident Evil, LOD sort of carved a spot out for itself despite its origins. The story is one that doesn't stray too far from your typical JRPG setup, but it hits all the right chords for me. This world once faced a great oppressor in the form of these things called winglies, but that was 10,000 years ago, and you're absolutely correct if you've guessed that the wingly threat is still present today. Along with it comes the threat of dragons, large mythical beasts that are nearly impossible to kill. The game starts with our main character doing everything he can not to become the contents of one of these dragons' stomach when he finds out that his childhood village is being attacked. After taking care of a few stragglers, he finds the whole massacre was all part of a kidnapping plot that saw his friend Shauna being held at a nearby prison run by the attackers, the Sandora army. After getting her out of there and making friends with a badass spear-wielding knight, we find out that Dart and a few other people can gain the power of the dragons by using a very Super Sentai-like transformation sequence. These Dragoon transformations can be used in combat to kick ass, and yes, it works like any other powered-up form found in your Breath of Fire type games and alike. So there are a lot of what you might call common elements here, but I think a lot of attention to detail and polish is what really separates LOD from the typical crowd at the time. Areas in between major locations are about as linear gets, but the pre-rendered backgrounds do a great job of world building so that when you get out of them, you have a real good sense of what this world's like. The more chibi 3D character models are definitely more defined and realistic looking than those found in FF7, but pretty far behind FF8's on-screen avatars. Once in battle, you could say things look very PS1, with most enemies being made up of easily countable large geometric shapes, and as a fan of that oh-so-recognizable PS1 3D aesthetic, I love it. Magic spells and attacks would look great if this were an early release for the console, but given its close proximity to real whoppers like Metal Gear Solid and Final Fantasy VIII, they seem a little more quaint by comparison. Not bad, but maybe just barely above average. For me though, the real draw are the amazingly designed pre-rendered backgrounds and the gorgeous CG cutscenes. Overall, this is a great looking game, but there's some weird stuff going on. There seems to be a lot of areas where 3D graphics are drawn just outside the boundaries where 2D background art ends. At first, I thought this was due to me using the PS1 digital HDMI solution, but upscaling the console's original RGB video output has the same effect, so go figure what the hell's going on here. Now, there's definitely a lot of 240p games made for CRTs that will include garbage graphics outside the area that almost always gets cut off by a TV's overscan, but typically this stuff didn't make it so far into the viewable picture. I'm certainly not calling this a downside or anything, but just something really interesting I thought I'd mention. The gameplay is exactly what you might expect from a PS1 RPG, but with a nice little twist. Attacks in this game are dealt out as combos that have to be executed by playing a sort of reaction-based rhythm game. The goal is to choose your attack and then hit the action button as the two on-screen squares perfectly intersect, and the best way I've found to get that done is to develop a bit of a rhythm to it. It's really cool seeing what would otherwise be some kind of special input in any other game replacing your average everyday attack, but I will admit it can be a bit tedious doing this for every single encounter, no matter how small. On the plus side, the more you use these combos, the more they level up, and on top of adding strength to the attack, a higher level might unlock a whole new one. This one little element had me grinding my ass off, not just to increase my stats, but to see what combo art I could unlock next. Listen, I know there's some stiff competition as far as PS1 RPGs go. I mean, realistically, this console has the largest library of quality role-playing games of any console ever made, so I get being choosy with what title you put your time into. But trust me, LOD is right up there with some of the greatest in the genre. It has an awesome story that'll keep you engaged and a combat system that proactively encourages grinding without outright necessitating it. Plus, and this was huge for me when I first played it, Legend of Dragoon is the very first console RPG I've ever played where the inventory screen has its own theme song. And really, isn't that enough of a reason to play this game? No? Well, then I guess we have very different priorities. Obviously, neither of us are objectively correct, but if one of us were, hypothetically speaking, it would be me. If we're gonna talk obscure RPG franchises that somehow managed to build up an impressively large library of entries without ever showing up on most people's radar, there is no better example than the Growlanser series. This obscure little dynasty has a staggering 11 releases under its belt, and there is no doubt in my mind that more than half of you have never even seen them out in the real world before.
Oh, good. You're awake.
My first introduction to the series came from the PS2 collection of Growlansers II and III, which is one of the last working designs releases I can remember coming out. I just so happened to stumble across this gorgeous looking box art while shopping for Christmas presents for my two younger brothers, and since all three of us share a love for JRPGs, I snatched it up without a second thought. And you know, at first I wasn't exactly blown away by how different it was. On the surface, it has all the hallmarks of a pretty typical JRPG experience. Awesome looking anime character portraits, a big story with a focus on warring factions and small players that get involved only to find out some even greater dangers lurking in the shadows. You know, pretty standard stuff. But it was most definitely the combat that really threw me for a loop.
No more games!
This series plays out sort of like a strategy RPG, but there's no grid, so instead of having to worry about how many squares a character can navigate, everyone in a fight can head from one side of the map to the other with no issue. It's just how long it takes them to get there that poses the real challenge. So the strategy instead becomes setting up all of your party members with actions to complete once they get where they're going, and then keeping an eye on the play area and making sure you can change your tactics when needed. It's a totally different skill set. In your average SRPG, you'll set up all of your actions individually and then watch them all play out while dealing with your enemy's retorts after the fact. With Growlanser, if you tell someone to attack a monster, you do have to wait till they get to that enemy, but once they're close enough, they'll keep swinging until either they or the bad guy dies. So the real fun comes in the form of giving everyone their orders and then fluidly changing those orders as the situation on the battlefield changes. For example, someone may be charging a powerful magic spell, and you're definitely going to want to deal with that, but what happens when a few more monsters spawn in near a weaker party member? There's this super fun dynamicness to combat here. It's rarely a set it and forget it type of encounter. You're always going to have to step in and change things up, and I really enjoy that. The stories for both Growlansers II and III are really fun, and they don't require 100 hours or so to get to their conclusion. In fact, they sit within that 20 to 30 hour range that I think is perfect for most RPGs. Of course, you can spend much longer on them if you want, but I found around the 35 to 40 hour mark I was so overpowered that things were no longer fun anymore. I absolutely loved my time with these 2D Growlanser games, but truth be told, I didn't pay much attention to the series after beating 2 and 3. Then at some point years later, I remembered they existed and looked to see if there were any other games in the series to check out, and there were a shit ton.
May this be the first and the last blast of this cannon.
There were a few 3D titles released on PS2, and the first one I really dug into was Heritage of War. And I will admit at first I was a little sad to see the iconic sprite-based look of the series go the way of the buffalo. But that disappointment faded pretty early on when I saw that under the surface this was the good old Growlanser I had grown to love all of those years ago. There's more of an emphasis on actively controlling your main character in combat this time around, so instead of using a cursor to select a spot to move to or enemy to attack, you just run to where you want them to be. Meaning you are going to lose the role that distance played in the original combat system, but even though it is very different, combat is just as chaotic and satisfying as it ever was. Plus, and arguably more importantly, this might be my second favorite story in the franchise. So even if you find yourself not exactly willing to give up the old gameplay and 2D visuals from the old games, I can assure you it is very well worth it here. After that, we have a true return to form with Wayfarer of Time. Now, this was originally one of the 2D PS2 releases, but never made it to US shores. Luckily, however, the PSP release did, and I'll admit, after playing Heritage of War and really enjoying it, it was admittedly very awesome returning to the classic mechanics that made me fall in love with parts 2 and 3. Combat arenas here are much smaller than in those games, so it can feel a bit claustrophobic, but other than that, this will make Growlanser fans feel right at home. And I think it may very well be my absolute favorite story out of any of the games I played under this banner. The only real downside I can think of is this ear-piercing ding sound effect used to confirm things. This is one hell of a harsh noise and you're gonna hear it a lot, so maybe don't play this with headphones on or you'll have tinnitus for the rest of your life. Bad sound effects aside though, this is an amazing series for RPG fans. It's got such a unique style and each entry feels truly different from your average JRPG. There have been fan translations for some of the more obscure titles in the franchise, and that is awesome, but even without those Japan-only releases, you'll find a good 4 or 5 solid experiences here. I gotta say, this one franchise more than anything else stood as an inspiration for this video. Growlanser has been around for so long and it stayed so true to its original intent, but for whatever reason it never really caught on with most fans of the genre. So if this is your first time hearing the name Growlanser, maybe go out and try one of these games for yourself and then pay it forward by telling someone else about it. Essentially what I'm saying is this video is sort of like a chain letter and you don't want 100 years bad luck, do you? Fuck, do people even use chain letters anymore? Is that a thing people know about? Have I gotten too old? Listen, we have most definitely covered some unique and interesting titles so far, but I doubt very much many games in this wide genre even come close to Resonance of Fate in terms of creating a wholly new approach to role-playing games. Developed by Tri-Ace, you know, the Star Ocean guys, Resonance of Fate is the story of 3 mercenaries who, more often than not, end up doing odd jobs for townsfolk instead of going out and being a soldier of fortune. These 3 have come together for varying reasons, but now they form this cute little family unit. There is a pretty interesting overarching story to uncover here, but to be honest with you, it can be really hard to dig into. Not really because it's hard to comprehend or anything, but more because a majority of the game's story is made up of small interactions with NPCs.
We must banish that suffering from the world!
Really, I think the best basis of comparison would be to the anime Cowboy Bebop. Sure, there's definitely a killer narrative linking all these characters together, but if you were to shave down all the episodes that don't deal directly with a character's motivation or main story, you'd be left with about 1 hour of actual runtime. Now, that's not exactly an insult, since I really did enjoy these smaller, self-contained stories, but the main plot is really interesting, I can assure you. I just wish it was served up to the player in some other form, because sprinkling small, cryptic scenes in between several long side missions can make it a very hard thread to follow. On the plus side, the characters are incredibly lovable, and even small interactions with them can often take the place of any real story development. Of course, you're not likely to be playing this one for the story regardless. The real draw here is the amazingly inventive combat. Combat that, to be honest with you, is sort of hard to nail down with words now that I'm sitting here trying to do it. The general idea is you have a turn-based system that allows for real-time movement. Anytime you're in motion, your active time points are being used up, so it's best to look around and plan your moves well before enacting them. Instead of your typical swords and sorcery type of situation, this game's going to have you blasting bad guys with firearms. Something that, while not exactly uncommon in JRPGs, always feels fresh and interesting to me. Speaking of which, you're not just going to be moving one turn at a time, taking pot shots at enemies. There's a system that allows you to perform maneuvers that feel like equal parts John Wick and Ghost in the Shell, using points collected from downing foes or taking out their armor. During these sequences, you have control over your character, so you can jump and shoot and change your view, but you're locked into one direction and one destination. Now that may sound a little complicated, and that's good, because it is. There are all kinds of subsystems going on here, like bouncing airborne enemies for more damage and a cool triple attack that can be performed, but to be totally honest with you, even after all of these years of playing this game, I'm pretty sure I only understand maybe half of what's going on here. Even when the game explains this stuff outright, it still feels very cryptic and convoluted, but I'll be damned if it isn't fun as hell to perform anyways. Instead of your average world map, ROF uses a kind of board game approach similar to the Persona titles, but instead of allowing free movement, resources need to be spent to unlock the way forward. Now, I have never really been a fan of this style where your characters are represented by a cursor and the world map may as well be a 2D image that needs to be navigated like a list, but adding in spending items to go forward really helps tie exploration into the combat in a sort of cool way. You get these sort of puzzle piece type of items by fighting enemies, and the special ones are given after completing jobs for clients, and I think that's a pretty good way to ensure all of these crazy systems feel like they exist in a singular world. It can certainly get annoying when you get to a point where you're stuck and you have to do side quests to finally open up the way to a new story event, but I think you might find that issue in most JRPGs in one form or another. There's also a big emphasis on customizing the way your character looks, but to be honest, I like the way they look out of the box, and the extreme amount of resources needed just to buy a belt or pair of pants can act as a deterrent anyways. Resonance of Fate is incredibly unique and very, very fun to play. It may be far from what you would expect from a Japanese role-playing game, but I think that might be the appeal for me. Sure, some of its innovations may not land exactly like I'd like them to, but it's definitely a satisfying package overall. If you enjoy a cool anime-inspired story, great characters, what seems like pre-rendered backgrounds, and a combat system you flat out will not find anywhere else, I would wholeheartedly suggest this one. It tends to stay at a relatively reasonable price on PS3 thanks to an English language release of a 4K version in Asia, which is not only something you don't see a lot with JRPGs, but also something that doesn't happen often to Tri-Ace games. So definitely head out and grab a copy while that's still the case, because it's not often something this wacky hits the genre and actually makes for a fun experience. And besides, where else are you going to fly through the air raining down lead on giant robot spiders? And to put a temporary pin in this video, I figured it'd be fitting to end on a game that OGs will know I almost never shut up about. I have covered this bad boy not just once, but twice here on the channel, and if I'm being totally honest with you guys, there's a good chance I'm going to do it again in the future. Ring of Red is a mech-based strategy RPG that takes all of the genre conventions you might be used to and absolutely throws them out the window in favor of a combat system that you quite literally cannot find anywhere else. But I think we might be getting ahead of ourselves. The game takes place in the 60s and in an alternate history where the fall of Germany during World War II led to both the US and USSR occupying Japan. This created a split in the country with North and South representing communism and democracy respectively. Oh, and also in this timeline, mechs are used in war sort of like tanks because Japan. These things are called Armored Fighting Walkers, or AFWs for short, and unlike a lot of mecha media, they move and act like you'd expect from pre-Cold War tech. The game starts with a military test operation meant to put 3 new experimental AFW units through their paces. You play as one of the test pilots, a half-German, half-Japanese guy who has some real issues with one half of that racial makeup. Our guy, Masami von Weizsäcker, is really looking forward to proving his skills as a pilot and the supremacy of his AFW, but when the mock battle gets underway, we find out that whoever's supposed to be piloting the 3rd AFW was found dead, and the current pilot is a Russian looking to steal the new, incredibly efficient weapon of war. Which the more dorky of you watching will know is essentially a point-for-point recreation of Gundam 0083's plot, aka half of the only 2 Gundam storylines I can stand to watch. So our duplicitous communist-backed friend ends up getting away with the brand new death machine, and the rest of the game is spent chasing after it. There's all kinds of military intrigue to be had, with our unit having to be disavowed so they can slip into Soviet territory and chase this thing down. You'll also come across some really interesting characters along the way, ranging from Italian POWs to Japanese freedom fighters. The dialogue, while sometimes cheesy and predictably anime, can also be pretty well written and wholesome too. plus all of the government organizations, cool-sounding acronyms, and military jargon that gets thrown around lends a very cool type of authenticity to things. And hey, story is always nice, but this is a strategy RPG, so what are we working with outside of that? Like I said, Ring of Red is an incredibly unique game, but it's actually interesting how bog standard it can be. On one end, you'll move representations of your characters around on a grid-based map, just like you'd expect, but when a fight actually goes down, that's when traditions get thrown out the window. Initiating an attack will let you look at what your enemy's packing and decide who's going to be part of your crew and who's going to be on the ground unit. When combat actually starts, you'll be taken to this cool 3D map where you have direct control over your AFW, but in a sort of limiting way. You can move your mech backwards or forwards using the D-pad, but you can't change their orientation. Like you may expect with these games, some AFWs are more effective at certain ranges, but you may want to take into account who you're fighting, since you may want to be outside or inside their most effective range to avoid damage, even if it means you'll be attacking with a handicap. Your ground units often have special abilities that are on a cooldown timer, so a smart Ring of Red player will keep an eye on those units, bringing them to the front when their special actions are ready and putting them back behind the AFW to avoid damage after that special's been performed. Of course, there's all kinds of conditions that'll have you keeping them up front because they can deal direct damage to the enemy AFW and its ground units. Speaking of cooldowns though, your main cannon is set to a timer, which I think represents the crew reloading and preparing it to fire. Once you're ready to shoot at your enemy, you head into a first-person view where things can be a little deceiving. At first it seems like you might be able to adjust your aim here, but that's not the case, or at least you can't do it directly. The only thing you can really do from this screen is hit X when you're ready to fire your weapon, the real control coming from when you choose to do that. You know, the longer you wait, the better your odds of actually hitting your target. So that seems easy, right? Just wait for 100% and fire away. Well, it's a little more complicated than that. And that's because your enemy is free to do really whatever they want while you're aiming your weapon. So while you're patiently waiting for that percentage to climb, they might be moving outside your effective range, ordering their ground troops to attack, or even worse, aiming their cannon at you. This little mechanic is amazingly stressful in all the best ways, and even comes with a built-in heartbeat sound effect as if to remind you, hey, you should be having an anxiety attack right now. Combat in this game is probably some of the most fun and engaging gameplay I've ever come across in a turn-based RPG, and I really mean that. There are seemingly hundreds of factors to consider before jumping into a fight here, like what soldiers you have equipped, the design of both you and your target's AFWs, the time of day, the terrain, and even where you're attacking from. And like most RPGs, it is immensely satisfying when you go into a fight having made all the right choices beforehand, leading to you just steamrolling the enemy. The ability to micromanage ground troops and their position adds an extra level of depth as well, especially towards the late game when more effective units and abilities start coming into play. Speaking of which, on the battle map there's a secondary mechanic that'll have you liberating enemy control points like towns and factories, which will let you heal yourself more than you could have otherwise and might net you some more units. Which is really good because once a ground unit's HP is depleted, they are permadead, making it a hell of a lot more morbid when you hear their little screams during battle knowing they can actually die. If you ask me, this game is about as close to perfect as you can get within this genre, but the keywords there are within this genre. SRPGs most definitely have some amazing features, but admittedly to someone outside of this small subculture of RPG fan, they may seem like downsides. For example, a fight in this game can last anywhere from 20 minutes to 2 hours, and while that time will be spent interacting with one of the most unique and well-implemented combat systems in an SRPG, to people with jobs and friendships, that might be a little much to ask. On the plus side though, you can save mid-battle and pick things back up when you have more free time, so don't let that deter you too much. Visually speaking, Ring of Red is just flat out on another level. Not only is the concept of 1960s mechanical tech mixed with an anime aesthetic already awesome, but the actual artwork here is to die for. The game never misses a chance to show it off either. It's clear a lot of effort went into making simple RPG menus and dialogue boxes period appropriate, with transparent projector overlays being used during mission briefings, and AFW customization menus looking very mechanical and low tech. I guess the keyword here is cohesive. Every single visual element in the game fits the world it takes place in, and while I don't think you could call this immersive exactly, it does really help sell Ring of Red as being a little more grounded than you would think for a game that has giant mechs fighting in a battlefield in the 1960s. They even went the extra mile by including real footage from wars and having AFWs added in. What a cool little addition. It seemed clear to me the team over at Konami working on this game really put their heart into the project. You can really feel the dedication and attention that went into even the smallest gameplay and visual elements. Without a doubt, this game was an absolute heartfelt labor of love. The kind of approach to making video games that you don't find as much today in the AAA space, which really sucks. It is a damn crime that more people never got into this one, but to be honest, I can sort of see why. Not only was it a strategy RPG, which almost always guarantees it'll have a very small audience, but it was made by Konami, a company that isn't exactly well known for their role-playing games. And yes, I can actually hear what you're screaming at your monitor right now. They are responsible for the Suikoden series, but to be fair, that is one franchise in an ocean of Konami IPs, and by the time Ring of Red came out, that series was effectively retro. Hell, I may have never stumbled onto Ring of Red myself if it wasn't for the cover art looking so damn cool. I can still remember that day browsing the video game shelf at Blockbuster and wondering if I should take a chance on this one. Well, needless to say, I'm very happy that I did, and here's hoping this video will act as a similar push in the right direction for you guys. The price of Ring of Red has jumped up a bit since the last time I checked, but it regularly sits around the $30 to $40 range for a complete copy, and I'd say that's a pretty fair price to pay for one of the most innovative, unique, and fun RPGs I've ever put my hands on. So definitely go grab yourself a copy of Ring of Red and then blame me for the anxiety attack you will likely have waiting for your firing accuracy to get above 80%. Well guys, I hope you enjoyed this one. I really don't get to talk about RPGs as much as I'd like, and being able to direct people towards a few titles they may not have heard of is definitely a huge bonus. I know a lot of you guys come here for videos covering games like Resident Evil or Silent Hill, and I'm not sure how much of an overlap there is between survival horror lovers and RPG fanatics, but I'm just glad you all made it to the end of this video. I've got a near bottomless well to pull from as far as obscure, underrated, or flat out underappreciated RPGs go, so if you're down for seeing more content like this, make sure to let me know. In the meantime, I gotta get back to work slaving over a hot computer, so I'll see all of you next time. But until then, as usual, I'm Jared. And this is Avalanche Reviews. Hello friends, if you're into a little more turn-based action, I'll have some more videos you might get into here on screen, and if you like what I'm doing here, I'd appreciate you swinging by my Patreon, but I've also got merch available at the Teespring store linked in the description. And if none of those things get you going, give me a good reason, I might start an OnlyFans for feet pics or something.